Welcome back. We are still inside this CIA rabbit hole, and this episode gets into recruiting, training, lying, and why some people are basically built for the job. And honestly, it gets uncomfortable in a really interesting way, because the whole thing is less tuxedos and more psychology with consequences. Bro, imagine thinking you are applying for a normal government job and then hearing, actually, you might be a spy. That has to hit like a movie scene in your own life. And then they tell you to go back to normal life like nothing happened, which is just sinister efficiency. I love that part where the secret is basically, continue being boring until we call you again. But that first cut is huge, because it tells you recruitment is already testing obedience and secrecy. Like, if you cannot hold a secret, you are not even getting to the fun part. Also, the family thing is wild because he basically says he was already emotionally distant enough to disappear into it. That is not just career fit, that is personality design. And the brutal part is they are not asking, are you healthy? They are asking, are you usable under pressure? That is such a cold way to sort human beings, but that is also the whole machine. The ethnicity piece is also important because he is basically saying the agency was forced to change after 9/11. They wanted different backgrounds, different access, different cultural fluency, not just the old elite pipeline. Which is funny because institutions only discover diversity when they are already late. Exactly, the crisis always becomes the hiring strategy. And then the training part sounds like some insane controlled experiment where the whole world is fake on purpose. That detail is crazy. The weather is the only thing they do not control. Even that feels like a flex from the universe. But the point is they are stress-testing behavior, not just teaching skills. And then the biggest misconception gets crushed, because basic training is not about learning how to kill people. It is about living, lying, collecting, and not getting caught. That is a much scarier skill set, honestly, because it works in real life too. The murder stuff is flashy, but the boring stuff is what actually changes the world. The lying section was where it got really sharp, because he is not saying spies lie randomly. He is saying they study liars first. That is such a key difference, because the best manipulators are often the best observers. Also, the rule that good liars talk less is brutal, because now every chatty person is under suspicion. If you are over-explaining, you are basically donating evidence. And the question thing is smart, because questions let you hide inside the conversation. You are controlling the room without revealing yourself. But the body language part is where internet culture really gets cooked because everyone wants one magic trick. Everybody online wants to say, he looked up right, so he is lying, like it is a cheat code. People love certainty more than truth. The baseline point is the real lesson because you cannot detect deviation unless you know normal. That is true in business, dating, friendship, everything. Time on target is basically relationship time, just stripped of romance. Which is such a depressing but accurate sentence. And then the core motivation framework is where it becomes a full human operating system. Reward, ideology, coercion, ego, that is actually clean if you think about it. It sounds like a startup pitch for controlling humanity. It kinda does, bro, that is the problem. But it is also useful because people really do move for those four things. And the ranking is the part I kept thinking about, because ideology is stronger than reward. That means people will do more for belief than for cash, which is terrifying and obvious at the same time. The coercion one being the weakest is the smartest thing, he said honestly. Because fear gets compliance once, but trust and belief get repetition. Guns are bad for customer retention. That is crazy, but also exactly right. The business angle gets really deep when he talks about messaging versus narrative. Emotional messaging creates movement, and the narrative comes later as the logic people tell themselves. That is why so much marketing feels manipulative, because it is hitting your feeling first and handing you a reason second. And he is saying politics and national security already understood this, while business was still acting naive. Which honestly is true because business loves to pretend it is just spreadsheets and product. Meanwhile, people are just selling identity, fear, status, and belonging with prettier fonts. The fatherhood example was sharp because it showed how ideology leaks out without people noticing. People tell you what they care about all the time if you let them talk. And then the final twist is his own self-image, because the CIA did not just recruit his skills, they validated his damage. That is the part that is actually unsettling, because being broken became useful and then became identity. A lot of high performers are basically just traumatized people who found a scoreboard. Which is not an inspirational poster, but it is probably true. And that is where we should probably leave it for now, because the next layer is what all this does to the mind once you realize the world is built on incentives. We will pick it up there next time because it only gets more interesting from here. Episode 3 is where the psychology gets even sharper and the personal stuff gets way more revealing. Welcome back, because this one gets into how spycraft leaks into normal life. We are talking lying, motivation, manipulation, and why the CIA loved checkboxes. And honestly, the weirdest part is how practical all of it sounds. Like, this is not tuxedo and cars fantasy stuff anymore. It is more like human operating system stuff. And that is exactly why it lands so hard. Wait, the interview itself already starts with secrecy, which is so wild. They basically say, congratulations, now go act normal. That is the coldest onboarding email in history. Imagine getting told you might be a spy and then being sent back to your hotel. And you cannot tell a soul, which is already the job preview. That early secrecy is doing real psychological screening. Because if you cannot hold a secret, you are useless fast. Or at least that is the harsh logic behind it. And he is kind of admitting he loved the secrecy part. Which, fair, some people hear spy and immediately become unbearable. Bro, he is absolutely one of those people. But the really interesting thing is he did not even have to fake disconnecting. He was already not close to his family, so the cut was easy. That part is darker than people realize. If attachment feels optional, covert work becomes way easier. And the CIA absolutely looked for that. That is the part people miss when they think recruitment is just talent. It is personality, background, emotional flexibility, all of it. And his ethnicity mattered too, which makes the whole thing feel very real. Post 9/11, they wanted people who could move through different worlds. Not just the same old elite pipeline forever. Turns out homogeneity is bad for espionage. Shocking discovery, apparently. But then training is where it gets almost absurdly controlled. A fake apartment, fake news, fake traffic, fake pressure. That is like the most expensive roleplay ever created. Somebody got paid way too much to simulate a roadblock. Yet that is exactly how you test judgment under stress. Because once the environment is controlled, you see who actually adapts. And who just memorized theory and panics immediately. The grading system is brutal too. Everybody gets measured against everybody else. Bottom performers get cut, which is very on brand for intelligence work. No participation trophies in spy school. Thank God, honestly. The death question is where people always get dramatic. He says basic field training is not about teaching everyone to kill. It is about not getting caught while collecting secrets. That is somehow more disturbing. Killing is too loud for the spreadsheet people. That is such a nasty sentence. But it makes the real hierarchy clear. Different officers need different tools for different jobs. A paramilitary officer needs combat skills. A human intelligence officer needs discretion, deception, and patience. That split is actually a big idea. The best spy skill is not some cinematic move. It is staying invisible while getting what you need. And then he gets into lying, which is where the whole conversation goes from cool to uncomfortable. He basically says they recruit people who already lie well. That is either genius or a warning label. Probably both. The distinction between good liars and bad liars is what matters. Bad liars talk too much. Good liars ask questions and reveal less. Which is actually terrifyingly useful outside espionage too. Think about dating, sales, politics, all of it. The quiet person in the room is always doing more work. Body language comes next, and that is where people get overconfident. He is saying your mouth and your body can be telling different stories. But he also pushes back on the internet nonsense around eye contact. So no, your eyes looking left does not make you a liar. Goodbye, 3-minute social media degree. The bigger point is baseline. You cannot call something deception unless you know what normal looks like first. That is such an unsexy truth, which is why people ignore it. Time on target, as he says, is everything. You need enough time with someone to notice the delta. Not just one weird blink and a conspiracy theory. Exactly, because half the internet is built on that fantasy. Then he drops the 4 motivations, and that is the real framework here. Reward, ideology, coercion, ego. It is almost annoyingly clean, but that is why it works. He is basically saying people are not that mysterious once you know what they worship. Reward gets things moving, but ideology is the heavyweight. Ego is huge too because people want to feel like themselves. And coercion is the weak one, even though movies pretend it is king. Turns out threatening people is not great for long-term relationships. Wild concept. That part about trust is actually the key. If you blackmail someone, you get one move. If you speak to their ideology, you get repeat behavior, which is exactly why messaging is more powerful than brute force. And then he gets into business, which is where it becomes unsettlingly normal. He says people volunteer their ideologies constantly if you listen. Your hopes, your fears, your politics, your childhood pain. Customers basically narrate themselves if you let them talk long enough. Which is bad news for people who think branding is just colors. The poor MBA guys just got cooked. His point is that messaging creates emotion, and emotion creates narrative. So the message hits first and the story comes later. That is why the same idea can work in politics and in business. People think they are buying logic, but they are usually buying feeling first. And that is where his own self-image gets really interesting. He thought he was simply high-performing and special. Then training told him he was also damaged, just usefully damaged. That is the CIA version of a compliment and a diagnosis. A brutal combo, honestly. But it explains why this whole framework is so sticky for him. The system did not just recruit his skill set. It validated the way he survived. And that is a very different kind of seduction. Because once a system names your wound as utility, you are hooked. That is why this episode is so good, because it is not about spies being cool. It is about how humans can be read, steered, and rewarded. And that is a great place to pause before we go even deeper. Because next time we get into what happens when this mindset starts shaping identity. Episode 3 is where the psychology gets sharper and the personal cost gets louder. Welcome back, because this one gets into the spy toolkit and the ugly little engine underneath it. We are talking interviews, lying, body language, and how people actually get moved around. And honestly, the wild part is how normal it all sounds once he starts explaining it. Wait, the first interview is basically just vibes and fit? And then they casually tell him, "Congratulations, you might be a spy." Imagine hearing that and trying to stay chill in the chair. He is internally auditioning for tuxedos while being told to keep it secret. That is such a brutal adult version of playground fantasy. But the secrecy is the real point, because the first test is whether you can disappear socially. That part hit me, because he is basically describing emotional severing as job preparation. Yeah, and he says it like it is just logistics. He already had that habit of keeping secrets, so the system just fit him too well. And that family distance is doing a lot of work here, whether he admits it or not. Right? Because if your home life already feels optional, covert service sounds efficient. Efficient is one word for it, emotionally alarming is another. He even says the CIA knew they needed different kinds of people after 9/11. That is one of the most fascinating institutional pivots, honestly. It is not just skill, it is diversity as strategy. Brown, younger, more globally legible, less stuck in old-school Ivy League blindness. And then they already know everything about your file before you even show up. That whole 9-month onboarding versus 18 months thing is insane. It says the machine is testing for fit, but also for usefulness. The nicest corporate phrasing for human sorting ever. Like a very advanced hiring funnel with darker lighting. And then training becomes this controlled simulation where they manufacture pressure. That part is almost more revealing than the spy stuff itself. Because they are not teaching one secret trick. They are teaching pattern recognition under stress. Exactly, and that is why he keeps coming back to psychology. The dead drop stuff is cool, sure, but the real weapon is understanding people. Also, the way he draws the line around killing is important. He is basically saying most officers are trained to disappear, not to destroy. That distinction matters because it changes what the institution values. One group learns stealth, the other group gets the movie trailer. That is such a good way to put it. What I loved is how he talks about lying like it is a craft with rules. He does not romanticize it, he systematizes it. Bad liars talk too much, good liars ask questions. That is actually painful because it feels so true. The extrovert salesman in every airport lounge just felt seen. Seriously, the more somebody performs their own sincerity, the more suspicious I get. But the body language piece is where people always oversimplify. He is very clear that eye movements and micro-expressions are internet garbage when used as certainty. Thank you, because social media has made everyone think they are a human lie detector. The truth is way less cinematic than that. Baseline is the real word there, and that is the part people miss. You cannot judge change unless you know what normal looks like first. That is honestly true in relationships, business, parenting, all of it. Time on target becomes the real skill, not instant genius. Which is less sexy, but much more useful. Always less sexy, always more useful. Then he drops the 4 motivations and the whole conversation levels up. Reward, ideology, coercion, ego is such a clean framework. And it is dangerous because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Ideology being strongest makes a lot of sense, though. People will do embarrassing things for money, but they will do historic things for belief. Exactly, and coercion being weakest is the part movies hate. Because movies love a dramatic gun to the head moment. Real life is just trust getting permanently shredded. That line about manipulation and motivation being the same coin is nasty. It is nasty, but it is also probably how power actually works. The moral flexibility point is the most uncomfortable part, because he is basically saying utility beats morality in that world. That is where the human cost starts to feel very close. And then he turns around and applies ideology to business and family, which is wild. The fatherhood example is so sharp because he catches the identity before the person even notices it. He is saying people volunteer their worldview all the time if you know how to listen. That is the thing that stings about good operators. They hear the sentence behind the sentence. And most of us are just waiting to talk about ourselves. Brutal, but yes. The messaging versus narrative distinction is another huge one. Emotional message first, logical narrative second, that is how people get moved. And brands keep pretending color palettes are the strategy. Exactly. And meanwhile, human desire is doing all the heavy lifting. The example about the app reminding you to read your kids a story is almost too good. It turns identity anxiety into product adoption. That is such a cold sentence when you say it out loud. But that is the playbook, right? The weirdest part is that he does not even sound cynical about it. He sounds like somebody describing weather, not ethics. Which makes it more unsettling, honestly. And then he gets to the second aha moment, which is the identity hit. That he was not just special, he was useful because of damage. That is a brutal sentence to build a life around. It explains the loyalty, though, because the institution named his wound as value. And once that happens, you stop asking who you are outside the machine. That is the real hook, not the badge. All right, we are going to leave it right there because this is getting darker by the minute. But that darkness is exactly why this episode matters. Next episode, we get into what happens when that same logic starts shaping identity even harder. Episode 3 is where the psychology gets sharper and the personal cost gets louder.